At the end of every interview that we have for teacher candidates, we will say, "What questions do you have for us?" And they will always ask, "Well, what kind of support can I expect?" And we will always say, "Well, don't worry, we'll give you a mentor." But it's not real mentorship. I mean, it's support with the difficult kid or the field trip form or the grade card, but it isn't coaching. That's where partners like EdConnective step in. They provide observation and feedback with practice. That's real coaching. Their mission is to ensure that every student thrives by facilitating exceptional educator growth. So whether it's science of reading, whether it's leadership development, whether you're trying to build the best recruitment and retention efforts, check out edconnective.com. Hello and welcome to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendent's and Leadership Podcast. I'm Peter Stiepelman. Today I'm recording from Western Massachusetts. In fact, it's not too far away from Alice's restaurant, if you're familiar with the Arlo Guthrie song. You can get anything you want at Alice's restaurant. Walk right in, it's around the back. Just a half mile from the railroad track. You can get anything you want at Alice's restaurant. No? Too much? Well, my guest today, Peter Dillon, is a superintendent from just a few miles away from that restaurant. And in part one, he describes working in Western Mass, a rural part of the state bordering Connecticut and New York, and he tells us of serving two school districts simultaneously and what he learned from that experience. And then in part two, faced with mid-year budget cuts during his first year, he had to make some really difficult decisions. And so my guest reminds us that budgets are a representation of your values. School and district leaders facing budget cuts all across the nation, particularly because of the absence of pandemic funding, they're really going to be able to relate to this situation. So thanks for tuning in. I'm Peter Stiepelman, and this is An Imperfect Leader. Today on An Imperfect Leader, Dr. Peter Dillon is my guest. And Peter is the superintendent of schools for the Berkshire Hills Regional School District, serving the towns of Stockbridge, West Stockbridge, and Great Barrington, Massachusetts. And at one point, he also served simultaneously as the superintendent of the Shaker Mountain School Union, which serves Richmond, Hancock, and New Ashford. And previously, Peter was the executive director of policy in the Office of Portfolio Planning at the New York City Department of Education. And it's where he helped to create and sustain more than 150 new schools. He was the principal of the Heritage School in East Harlem, and he taught in New York, as well as in the Republic of the Marshall Islands as a Peace Corps volunteer. And when a member of his community was asked to describe him, she said, "He takes a calm and agile approach that's caring at its core." Peter, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Well, Peter, you and I met only days after I retired from the superintendency, and you really were caring at the core. I mean, just the fact that you agreed to meet, it was actually kind of pretty funny, I thought, because I think my father and his friend, they set us up. They proposed that they'd sit at a table away from us as we talked, and I think the last time that my father did something like that, I was on a date in third grade with Tara Stein. We went to the movies. She wore white gloves. But it was in our conversation that I learned that you were serving two communities as superintendent, and I'm wondering if we could start there. Would you talk just a little bit about that experience and what you learned about leadership?
Yeah, so at the time I live and work in Western Massachusetts, and our schools are relatively small, so the three schools that I'm primarily responsible for have a little more than 1,200 students. And in the neighboring community, Richmond, had about 150 students in a pre-K to 8 school. And in Hancock had about 50 students in a K to 6 school. And in New Ashford is actually called a non-operating district. So they didn't have a school, but they still needed a superintendent to help with their budget and taxes and other things. So my school committee asked me to serve in both roles about 80% of my time in my primary district and 20% of my time in the other district to explore the possibility of down the road the districts potentially merging or consolidating. And all in, I did it for about 7 years, first with the three towns, Hancock, New Ashford, and Richmond, and then the last 3, almost 4 years just with Richmond. And interestingly, part of why I stepped away from it was distracting from my primary role. And the likelihood of consolidating the districts seemed to have evaporated. And now that I'm more stepping away, it's come back up again as a possibility. So we're continuing to have conversations about it. But you you may be a little more attractive when there's a little more distance. It's interesting work. It was fun getting to know another set of communities. There were some shared needs and some overlap that made some of the work fairly straightforward. And then there were some things that were really unique. Each town, particularly in small towns, has a different select board or finance committee with different expectations, and how much did the budget go up each year, and what was okay and what was not okay, and different levels of engagement and involvement in trying to reduce costs or even manage or micromanage particular line items.
Right. So I imagine that there were some opportunities to sort of do some bulk purchasing and things like that could be done together. I also imagine, just having moved from the state of Missouri, where there are 518 school districts and almost half of them have 350 students or less. And so one of the things that is often on the conversation topic list is the sort of regionalization and creating shared school districts. And I imagine, to some extent, even things like school or teacher salaries play a role, because you're presiding over one district where salaries are at one rate, and then you're at another where they may be at a different. How did you reconcile sort of those differences between districts? Or
Yeah, I mean, you just walk the line carefully. The Richmond and Berkshire Hills were very close, and a lot of the Richmond students go on to attend Berkshire Hills for high school. So that was pretty easy. Hancock is in a less economically stable community, so their salaries of the 13 school districts in Berkshire County, their salaries were the lowest. So that was hard, and that created some tension, even to the point where people would leave Hancock to be hired at Richmond or Berkshire Hills for a significant increase.
in my book and in the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's a dimension. It's called the leader's learning work. And it really is like the mind of an organization's work. And inside that dimension, there's a term, harvesting the collective wisdom. And any major initiative has to consider the people most impacted by that decision in order to move forward. And it's the case with technology or curriculum adoption. And you make decisions with the people most impacted. And over the last few years, you and your colleagues, as I've been reading a little bit more about you, that you've been rethinking or redesigning what it means to be a high school student. And that really requires being really clear, like having a shared image of what that looks like. And I wonder if you would describe the process that you use to harvest that wisdom of, and I say your community, but it's multiple communities, and sort of, what do their expectations and beliefs and values have for their children as they're graduating? How'd you kind of come together to marry both of that? What skills children need to have to be life ready, and then really what these communities want for their children?
Yeah, no, I mean, and I wish in some ways that I could articulate this to you in a totally coherent and linear way, but it just doesn't happen that way.
Well, that's probably good advice for those who are considering how to do this work, that there isn't a linear way to do this, that there are going to be cycles of sort of inquiry and starts and stops and mid-course corrections and those types of things. So I'll be quiet while you talk with them.
Our big thing was sort of coming off of COVID. There were really two responses that most institutions or organizations took. One was to try to get back to the way things were, and the other was to use it as an opportunity to create something different, right? So there's this broader notion that you never let a good crisis pass you by, because you should do something, and we might have been a little too bold, and we're still working through it, but towards the tail end of it, we decided it was time to make some significant shifts at the high school, and we worked on it, and we had some grant funding to do it, first from Mass Ideas and later from the Barr Foundation, which really helped a lot. But we worked on three big interconnected ideas. One is to eliminate or do away with traditional tracking system. So we're having kids in 9th and 10th grade be in mixed ability groups, right? And that's not a new thing to do. People have been doing it for decades or more than decades, but it was a new thing for us. So that was one piece. The second was to start to make a shift towards proficiency-based assessment. which is interconnected to it. And then the third one was around expanding opportunities for student voice. And we did a bunch of work there and actually put together this giant student adult advisory board. And the high school has about 500 students, and the student adult advisory board has about 60 students in it, right? Which is really quite remarkable and sort of unheard of in my previous work or experience. The students really stepped up. The interesting thing was, of the three sort of legs of the table, the student voice one took off first. And in some ways, the students used the training and support they got to question the other two, right? So all of a sudden, kids who in a traditional system were seen as very high achieving were wondering, were they getting shortchanged being in classes with peers who might not be interested in or up for or as excited about traditional notions of academic rigor. So a small group of students really held their feet to the fire, did research, got advice, did independent studies, came back to the school committee and said, are we getting shortchanged? And led some really good conversations about it.
Yeah, I think about students as an incredible, powerful leverage piece when you're considering any change within your district, right? Because often they feel like it's being done to them. Hence, here you had an advisory of, more than 10% of your student body. And I imagine you were pretty intentional about opening it up to anyone and also being thoughtful about whose perspective was being represented within that group. Because I often am contacted by superintendents in a coaching capacity wanting to talk about student advisories. And how do they do that in a way that is authentic and genuine and not just sort of saying, well, I brought students together and asked them a question and then sent them on their way. And it sounds like you really leveraged and honored and in a genuine way that gave them not just an opportunity to talk, but to have real decision-making capabilities and capacities. So what might have been some things that sort of changed based on the feedback that you got?
Yeah, I mean, the couple things they pushed on was, one, sort of the broader notion of academic rigor and how we can figure out ways to challenge everybody and what kind of supports different teachers need to meet shifting standards, right? So in working in New York, that was sort of just part of our background and training and professional growth was to work with whoever came to you. But in a track system, it typically isn't. And you were often designated as, I'm the teacher of the honors students, or I'm the teacher of the college prep students, or I'm the teacher of the standard students. So that's been a shift. And some teachers have been really open and excited about making that shift and have demonstrated a high level of success. Some other teachers have struggled with it and been resistant. And then there's some other places where, though we've stepped away from a formal tracking system, in world languages, you could have gotten some credit in middle school for advanced work in Spanish. So there's an implicit leveled system that's not quite tracking, but in some ways it's
Well, and sometimes families know how to navigate. They say, well, if my kid takes band, then the schedule will match up for certain classes. So while exactly. Yeah.
So that's been interesting. The other one is the whole work around proficiency and what those are and what those mean. So going back to my sort of nonlinear thing, as we're doing this work, we're also engaged in a deep project that I think almost every district in the country is now around what's the portrait of the graduate and what do we want students to know and be able to do and demonstrate. And that work's not quite complete. And in some ways, it needs to be to have the proficiencies make sense. And it needs to be to do some of the planning, but those are all sort of moving along at the same time. And I think every iteration gets a little more refined.
Yeah. Having I experience, we called it standard reference grading, and when you're sort of talking through a 1 to 4 scale, and that you have some children and some families that are used to, the equivalent of a 4. And when they are assigned a 3 based on the fact that they demonstrated learning, they are at proficiency, and it just sort of like throws their world into total disarray when they're not getting, I need that 4. That's what I need is the 4. And then separating out working, your habits of work from the actual what did you learn is sort of a real overwhelming revelation for some families,
Well, that and then sort of the people sticking to that some previous iteration of an evaluation or assessment system wasn't arbitrary, right? Like it was profoundly arbitrary. What's the difference between a 97 and 100? Like, I don't know, right? So now we moved to...
You brought extra tissues, you got the 100.
Right. It's interesting, but
well, and when you're in a large school system or a larger one, or in your case, maybe in terms of different schools, and you're teaching the same topic, yet you are following a different scope and sequence, and then there is this teacher believes that they haven't yet come together on a shared image of what proficient means. So it's a lot of work, and what a big lift, and not easy work, but I'm glad that it sounds like you've been doing it for some years and that people are sticking with it.
Yeah. And again, like people will push back, people will grouse about it, but I think we're starting to have some momentum and an early indicator. Like you always like to look at outcomes and what's going on. And obviously testing is not the be all and end all, but in Massachusetts, typically students take tests at the end of 9th grade in biology, and often at the end of 10th grade in English and math. And our initial biology results are through the roof, right? Like kids are approaching it. They're doing much better than they did before we started this approach. The biology teachers really figured it out. And there are different points for kids of all different levels to engage in meaningful ways.
Right. Well, then that's profound proof, right? That it doesn't diminish those who have traditionally been high achieving. And in fact, it lifts all students and that nobody lost out. In fact, more children actually succeeded. And I think that's what you need.
Area. We have more work to do in English and social studies. They're not tested subjects, at least in 9th grade. And for some reason, people are finding it harder to create engaging curriculum that's accessible at multiple levels simultaneously.
How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think like we're all profoundly imperfect, right? And we've got good days and bad days, and the thing that works for us is to be in some sort of data cycle where you can reflect on what you're doing and then make shifts and adjustments and presumably do it a little better the next time. And I think the other thing that's tied up in it is a large part of this job can be around being engaging or charismatic or being the cheerleader. But there's also a really important part about being honest and humble. And at the core of learning is the opportunity to make mistakes and grow from them, and to model that for teachers and students and in some cases for families.
And we'll be right back. Hey, district leaders, I know you already know this. In schools worldwide, cell phones are posing real challenges on student engagement and mental well-being, and I want you to meet Yonder, a proud sponsor of An Imperfect Leader. And let me share this story from a visit I made to some schools in Silicon Valley. I asked some kids what they liked about Yonder, and after some funny looks, they shared that actually, with Yonder, teachers don't have to battle with them over phones anymore. In fact, one kid said to me he didn't have to worry anymore about his parents texting him in class, and the kid next to him sort of shoved him and goes, "Texting? My mom used to FaceTime me in class." I want to introduce you to a support system that increases teaching and learning. I want you to discover why 1 million students choose Yonder daily. Minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. To learn more, go to overyonder.com. YONDR. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader, called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. My guest today is Peter Dillon, the Superintendent of Schools for the Berkshire Hills Regional School District in Western Massachusetts. In this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they've made, and then we discuss it. Peter, what happened?
Yeah, so I've been a superintendent here for 15 years, and I could probably give you 15 or 30 or 45 examples of places where I misstepped or could learn from something. But the one I picked was in my first year as superintendent. In Massachusetts, we have these things called 9C budget cuts, where the governor can make mid-year reductions to the budget. And that's particularly hard because if it's a mid-year cut, the impact is twice as large as a cut going into the year. So I'd been here maybe 3 or 4 months, and the governor made this decision to make some mid-year cuts. And I had to work a community that I was new to through how to make sense of it. Now, the really good news was going into that, I'd gotten some good advice to have, and I think a lot of people do this, a thoughtful entry plan. So I ran around for 90 days and interviewed something like 200 people, like all the usual suspects and the unusual suspects, and used it to really answer 3 questions. What's working well, what's not working so well, and what would you change? And talk to police chiefs and fire chiefs and town administrators and select board members and students and parents. And I couldn't be happier that I did that, because then this budget thing happened, right? And it's shades of what we're going through now, right? We're at another fiscal clip. The ESSER money's drying up. Schools and school districts are making really tough choices. And at the time, I was a little younger and I was a little more naive. And I tried to do it in a way that was palatable and not terribly impactful on folks. And what I know now, and I sort of knew it then, but I hadn't fully internalized it, is most of every school district's budget is tied up in people and benefits, right? 80%, 85, 90%. So if you're confronted with terrible mid-year cuts or even before the next year cuts, that you can't cut out paper clips and copying to get any significant saving.
It sounds like you're already moving into the second question, which is what got overlooked. And I think it's kind of interesting because so many of us who have been in the superintendency, we try to keep as much of the cuts away from the classroom until we realize to some extent that, as you noted, 80 to 85% of our budgets are people. And so I'm curious. So would you say that's sort of the biggest thing that got overlooked from in that experience?
I think so. And also sort of this tension between do you do better work with slightly fewer people who are well-resourced than keeping as many people as you can and having them be under-resourced, right? And it's also like tied to the whole notion of deferred maintenance, right? So you can defer maintenance for a year or two, or not buy computers for a year or two, and then 3-4 years down the road, you have this terrible headache or hangover because you underinvested. So my initial decision was to try to save as many positions as possible and reduce things like stipends and supplies and curricular materials and department leader positions and a whole host of other things. And in hindsight, and then other stuff, and we're negotiating with the union at 1 a.m. and nobody's clear-headed at that point, and we're throwing things on the table to make things work. So one of the ones that they still tease me about to the day was in my first year as superintendent, when I'd already taken a pretty big cut in salary from coming here from New York City. I also voluntarily reduced my own salary to my wife's horror, who does that at 1 a.m. And we did all these things, and the people who survived, and it wasn't a massacre, right? But the people who, it may be something on the order of 12 people out of a 300-person staff lost their jobs, right? So it was significant, and it's really significant for those 12 people. But from an institutional standpoint, it wasn't huge. The people that were left really had to struggle to be effective with reduced resources going further. And had we gone from 12 to 14 or 15 positions, that would have left enough additional resources for sustained professional development, for some targeted overtime to support particular initiatives, perhaps to maintain some of the teacher leader roles that are essential to moving school reform forward.
So you've really painted a really interesting picture, and one that I want to move in so many different directions, because I'm thinking about all the people you met and talked to in the first 90 days and the sort of relationships that you built there. And they were able to interpret your decisions with a very different, through sort of with, I guess, a more like with a charitable perspective, right? Because they knew what your goals were. You listened to them. You were collecting and sort of sorting their goals and their wishes for the district. And then within your own internal system, you now were making some really difficult choices about positions and people. And sometimes the people are well rooted in your community, particularly in smaller communities where that position makes sense, yet that person is held in such high regard. And so I'm kind of curious, what did you learn about relationships, or maybe what new relationships were formed? Although it sounds like at this time, it was mostly about really establishing yourself as somebody who cares deeply for this new district where you were working and having to make difficult decisions with others. What did you learn about relationships?
One of our important core values, often we have meetings and we go through our norms and sort of check in on what we value. And one of the big ones is this notion of presuming positive intentions. So I think the big benefit of running around and talking to all those people and interviewing them was this notion that we're all working toward a common purpose and we're on the same page, right? And I don't know if I could have done those cuts and still survived as a superintendent if I hadn't have taken the 2 or 3 months to run around and talk to all those people. And you look and you're aware of this as I am, that the time for superintendent, the average time in the seat is it's a little worse in urban areas, maybe 2 years, and in rural and suburban, it's 3 years.
That's exactly right. And if you're a leader of color, it is less than 2 years. If you're a woman, it can also be at around 2 years nationally. And so, if you don't build some relationships, you can say we have a norm of positive intent. However, what you did was you met with people face to face. And when you make decisions close to people, with people, then they can actually live that sort of positive intent value.
Yeah. And it was interesting because it took a while, right? So it's almost like I lived down the road from Arlo Guthrie and the trash stuff and Alice's restaurant, right? That's all around us. And they talk about it as the massacre, right? So we had budget massacre. And it took a couple years to sort of build back up and build trust after that. But most people realized it was an external thing put upon us by the governor in a tough budget cycle. And we did our best to work through it. The other thing we did is part of why I reduced my own salary was teachers voluntarily agreed to a couple furlough days. So it was a way we could all be on the same page, which I think was important.
I think that builds relationships. So while you may be chided by your own family, I think it's an important and demonstrable. It really symbolizes that you see yourself as the lead learner, and that you are you don't see yourself as any more important than any other level of leader in the district. So I think that's important. What frustrated you?
In that process, sort of being painted into a corner, and even though I was pretty smart and pretty sophisticated about figuring out context, it's very hard to make those decisions 4, 5, 6 months into a new role. On some superficial level, I thought I understood how everything worked and interacted, and on a deeper level, I couldn't possibly have understood all of that. So I think that was frustrating. And I didn't anticipate sort of the notions or things connected to survivors' guilt and the people who kept their jobs but lost a bunch of other things would feel about.
Oh, yeah. What could you have done differently?
A lot of it went well, right? I mean, you can almost write about it like in a textbook, like these are some things that went really well. Maybe going a little deeper in positions to leave more resources for the people that were still there. In hindsight, is pretty clear. If this were to happen again, I would do. And the other thing, and I'm still sort of talking about this and doing it now, I think it's often budgets are done to people, and people are really anxious about budgets because they're connected to numbers, right? And numbers can be intimidating for a lot of people. And in its simplest form, like budgets are just a representation of your values, like your mission statement. And we have an obligation to explicitly teach that to people early enough so they can weigh in and have conversations that often happen at the 11th hour, right? So the week before a budget vote, somebody complains that a kindergarten teacher is losing his job. A week before the budget vote is sort of too late to complain, and they don't have the whole context. So a thing I continue to try to work on is getting parents and staff and community members to deeply understand the budget in the kind of time frame that they can influence and have conversations about it. That isn't the week or the 2 weeks before the budget vote, when those decisions are pretty baked in and hard to change. And we've all sort of seen what happens when horse trading happens at the last minute, and it tends to not be value aligned or mission aligned.
Yeah. One of the things we often ask leaders to consider is just to avoid the impulse to make an impulsive decision, or that the sense of urgency, and it can be considered horse trading, or and I think it's a really good phrase for it, because it is misaligned to everything that you've been doing, educating. And then you actually lose trust because it has been all these months going into it saying, we have really been clear on what we're trying to create together, and this is totally out of nowhere, right? And so, I'd like to add a grant writer. Why? All of a sudden? So yeah, that's interesting. In the end, what was something that was good that came out of this experience?
I think it started part of this dialogue around how do we use resources, and the obvious question, or the things always people think about when you talk about resources, are money, right? How much money do you have, and where's the money being spent? But the more nuanced ones, and probably the ones where you have much more flexibility, are around people and time, and how people's time is used, and how we just allocate time. So that's been a conversation that we continue to have 15 years later, and that's something I'm really proud of. We've not solved the problem; like, we're still tweaking the schedule and rethinking it, and should the strongest teachers work with the ninth graders, or should the strongest teachers teach AP physics? And it doesn't have to be an either or, but we should have good conversations.
Absolutely. My guest today was Peter Dillon, the Superintendent of Schools for the Berkshire Hills Regional School District of Western Massachusetts. And I started out by talking about just how you are caring at the core, how that is how you've been described. And truthfully, and truly, after our time today, it is abundantly clear that you care about your students, you care about your staff, your teachers, and the communities that you serve. You are honest and you are humble, and I am grateful for your time. Thank you so much, Peter.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I appreciate the time to talk with you. It's been great.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created our artwork, a wood print-inspired Daruma doll butterfly. Remember, imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It's a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader. I'm Peter Stiepelman. Please join me next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader. Leadership in After Action. Imperfect leaders Are you facing challenges filling open speech-language pathologist positions within your district? It's kind of a silly question because I know you are. Empath Speech understands the critical need for qualified professionals in your schools. They recognize that communication lies at the heart of academic success, and that's why they're dedicated to helping you bridge the gap by offering expert therapists and innovative telehealth solutions. Don't let open positions hinder your students' success. Partner with Empath Speech today and ensure every child in your district has access to the speech therapy they deserve. Empath Speech, EMPAT Speech.com. Empowering students, empowering schools.